it's not everything. No gig like that is everything you want. Musically, it's not everything I want, but it's everything. Everything that happens there is something I'm good at. So, and maybe that's just coincidence since I've been there so long.
Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 90. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. It's been a while since we've had an episode like this one in a couple of different ways. On one hand, it's been a while since we've had a guest today, and I'm going to be talking to Bob Moore, and I'll tell you more about him in just a moment. But also, for a podcast that talks a lot about the tools of musicianship, it's been a while since we talked about ways that you can use those tools in a way that allows you to be either of service and or get a little bit of income from using those tools. Now, Bob Moore and I, we have quite a bit in common, and there's a lot of things that we could chat about. For starters, we're both composers. And right there, I need to bring something up. This is coming out, or it should be coming out on Labor Day Monday, which is September 2nd. The conversation that I had with Bob was recorded on August 20th, so almost 2 weeks ago. Had we recorded even 1 week later, we would almost certainly be talking about something that is very recent news and is very big for all composers. Well, I shouldn't say all, but for many composers, many arrangers, and many educators. And I'm not going to really talk about it today, other than to say, if you don't know what I'm talking about the notation program called Finale, announcing on Monday, August 26th, that it was going to be discontinuing all of its notation programs. Now, I think it's maybe for the best that Bob and I were not able to chat about this because it affects me, it affects him. The first reason is why talking about any breaking news is not necessarily good. It's better for clicks because people want to read about something as it is breaking. But I could have recorded an episode on Tuesday and said one thing. I could have recorded an episode yesterday, said something else. It's Thursday as I'm recording this intro, and I could say something yet different today. And that is because there is news, there is reaction to that news, very vocal reaction. There is a counter reaction. In other words, all of the information needed to give an informed opinion is not yet there. So I'm just going to say this for right now. In a few episodes from now, possibly as few as 2, but we'll have to wait and see, I am going to comment in more depth about this, and I'm hoping that I can get a guest on here to chat with me. I'm really trying to see if I can get Jason Lofredo to find a clearance in his schedule. He could come on and chat with me about this. He is the guest that I had on before when we talked about Finale and other notation programs on a previous episode. So we'll be due for a post-finale follow-up to that. So hopefully that will happen. No, it is not on the calendar, but I just want to let you know that when I talk about it, I'll talk about it properly. So what are we talking about today? I'm talking to Bob Moore today about being a church music director. Now, this is a very broad topic, so we're going to talk about being what would be labeled as a traditional music director. And I invited him to talk with me about it because we have a lot of common points, but we have each served this job in different denominations. I come from a more almost piano exclusive background, whereas he comes from an organ heavy background. So between the two of us, I felt like we had a lot to offer on this discussion, and I still think that we really just scratched the surface. One of the things I do say during our conversation that I think is worth reiterating or pre-iterating, since you're hearing this first, is that we are not talking about faith when it comes to this. We're not talking about your religion. Now, should you consider being a church music director if you are anti-religious or if you have a religion that is completely different than the church you are seeking to work for? As you'll hear me say in just a moment, once again, I think that is a personal decision. That is your own personal moral decision. And that I know for a fact that there are people who are deeply religious and devoted in addition to doing their job. And there are also people who are completely unreligious who are serving their church as well. If you're a church member listening to this, that may come as a surprise, but there are a lot of people who do their job well and support the mission of their church while they may privately believe something else. And sometimes those differences in the belief system are small, sometimes they're big. Some people could not work for a church if it was incompatible with their beliefs. So again, I just want to say that up front, we're not going to talk very much about that, but I thought it was worth to get that out. Haven't really said much about Bob. Bob lives in the Jacksonville, Florida area. He is a composer. He's a published composer. He's also been a church music director for very much of his adult life. So let's go ahead and get to it. This is my conversation with Bob Moore. Well, it is great to talk to you. I was just thinking this morning, time flies. We met in person not too long ago, or so I thought. It's been over 13 years
Yeah, I
since we
believe it.
last spoke in person. That was a concert in 2011, percussion ensemble concert. So
Oh yeah, that's what it was.
um, it's great to connect with you again. I'm wearing my Atlanta Braves shirt in solidarity of the many things we have in common, and you're wearing a Jacksonville University shirt in solidarity as well. It's like, you
Yep,
know, kept the Seminoles hat, on the shelf. We don't need to bring out differences today. So
we're solidarity right here.
exactly.
I'll even give you one of these, but it's for the Braves.
All right.
They
Uh,
need it.
since you've got the JU shirt on, I never miss a chance when I talk to a fellow alumnus to bring up, the great Dr. Shermer, Dr. William Shermer, because I figure if my podcast accomplished one thing, if it lets listeners know about a composer that should be known if he spent even 1/10 of the time marketing that he does creating. But
Right.
so you studied, with a slightly different era than I did, but Doc has been around for a long time. What's a lesson or two that has stuck with you, whether as a composer or even in life in general, since you studied?
Um, I'd say, and this is through the lens of time. So, I wonder how much I remember or how much I've invented at this point or interpreted.
Right,
I think that Doc taught me two things. He taught me to always keep working.
right.
Anytime I've seen him in the last 30 years, he goes, "Well, what you working on? What you working on?" Well, and I always made sure I have an answer to that because, you want to be working on something. Um, and the other thing was to be very conscious of consistency.
Hmm.
Consistency in your harmonic language, consistency within a piece. You
Yeah,
can write anything you want. And he was a good composition teacher in that he allowed you to write in your own voice. Whatever you were interested in doing. I don't know if that was your experience, but it was
yeah,
mine. Um, as long as you could justify what you were doing, even if he didn't really understand what you might be doing at the time. That was true for a lot of the church music I was writing at the time. It really wasn't his thing, that kind of church music, but
right.
he'd always find something that would improve it. And he was kind of like that too. I can go back to old pencil manuscripts, which, at this point, I don't do those anymore. But every once in a while, I find one of his notes. Like, he'd be like, "Oh, Robert, what if you tried this?" And it'd be like, one note changed everything. So I think those are two things I could
Yeah,
think of.
you're right
What about
about
you?
that he on the way that he would teach no matter what the style is. My freshman year, I feel like there was a lot of composition majors during my freshman year, and then through either graduation or people changing majors or transferring to another school, it was just maybe I think two or three of us, by the time I graduated. But in that freshman year, there was someone he really just wanted to have a rock band. I mean, he looked kind of like he could have sang in Alice in Chains or something like that.
Yeah, we had a couple of those.
Yeah, and I heard from him and someone else is like Dr. Shermer would teach him, for that style. It's like he was not an elitist when it came to anything like that. And in fact, some of the other places I was looking at the time, if you didn't write in the idiom that they wanted,
Yeah.
you're pretty much not getting in. I don't know if that's changed in the last few years. I
I,
feel like,
I think it has. There was a real tyranny of academic composers. Probably you were on the tail end of it.
mhm.
I might have been too. I'd circled back to music after, the late great Jimmy Buffett. He had some people claim there's a woman to blame. Well, I got a little off track in my young years and went in the army and then came back to music. So I was a little older student, but I think I came in at the end of that. It was kind of the tyranny of the serialist, and he was part of that. I think that's how he, came up in his training. But if you weren't writing in that academic style, you were on the outs. And then, John Adams comes along, everything changes. Uh,
You know,
I don't
I'm
think, yeah, I don't think it's that way anymore.
I'm reading a book now, and it's like, I guess if I can actually read who the author is. I'll have to look it up later. It's called
Yeah.
Music After the Fall. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
heard.
Well, as much as you read, I can understand.
Yeah, this was an academic composer or teacher in the area that recommended it, and
Yeah.
it was after I read The Rest Is Noise, Alex Ross. It was
Oh,
after I
sure.
read
Read it
after I
three
read
times.
that. The he commented and said, check out Music After the Fall, and I'll have to email you who the author is, for music since 1989, and the fall refers to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and
Okay, cool.
just kind of like what composition has done in terms of like what we might call innovative since then, which kind of fits into my whole theory that we're not in the same era that we were when we, since 1900. I
Oh,
mean, really,
hmm.
you could probably argue we're like 3 or 4 eras past 1900, but
Yeah. Depends
I
on who you
think
talk
we're at
to.
least in the second era. So,
Ted Goya is another person who speaks well to that. How
hmm.
I don't know if you know him.
No, I don't.
Yeah, Goia. I bet if you looked him up and saw some of his books, you'd probably go, "Oh, that guy."
Okay.
Our mutual friend Tony Steve is big on him. And
Right. Okay,
yeah,
well, let's I mean, I know we could talk composition, Doc, Jaguars, Braves, so many things that we can chat about all day. Um,
nobody will watch it.
well, not the audience that
Right,
watches
right, right, right.
others. Um, I wanted to talk about, what on this podcast, I like to talk about various things that musicians can basically use what they've been trained to do and either make a living or at least make part-time income. And, one of the things that I haven't talked about yet, but I've alluded to in my own life is just working for a church.
Okay.
And I've talked about that as an aspect of being a church pianist and an accompanist, but I haven't really gotten into music directing. And I thought you would be a great person to help chat about that. And I'll go over just a few reasons why, and also to kind of set some terms for the listeners here. So I guess right off the bat, talking about churches and music, one of the things we're not going to really be talking about is any theology or anything pertaining to like your own personal faith or lack of faith, and how that relates to the job. I would say that's a kind of a personal moral decision.
Sure.
But I would say you probably will not enjoy working for a church that is greatly against your values or what you believe. It's like you probably won't find one that's 100% in line, but if you can stand to be there, and
100%.
be of service to what they're looking for out of you, it still is a place where you can work and use your musical skills. And also it can be a training ground for developing those skills is one of the things that I've found, because if you get in the right place, could give you an opportunity to grow your skills as a conductor, grow your skills as a performer, and in our case as a composer. So
Agreed.
also you're coming from, come from slightly different denominations. I have worked in Baptist and Methodist churches, and correct me if I'm wrong, Catholic and Episcopalian is your
Right.
background. All
It's
right.
me.
So I guess what was your path to kind of working in a church, and like did you and like just kind of name off the various hats that you've worn, like if it includes organist or music director, and just kind of what led you to where you are now.
Okay. I alluded to my swerving path as a young man. Uh, that led me after the army, I got married, and we were going to a church where I just wanted to sing in the choir, and that was a Catholic church. Where my first wife and I got married. Sang in the choir. Eventually, the choir director leaves. They needed someone to be the choir director. I'd gone back to school for music. I guess I'm next person up. And I've heard that story a lot from folks. You just happen to be there and you fall into the job. And then I faked it until I made it, for a long time. Piano was not my first instrument, nor was the organ. So I picked those up along the way. And I spent 20 years at that parish. I had my kids baptized there. It was home. But I'd always told myself, if I'm here when I'm 50, then I'm going to consider myself a failure. I just thought I needed to be somewhere else. And that parish also gave me a lot of experience building a choir, learning a lot about liturgy, Catholic liturgy, but some of that liturgy and worship applies across the board. Became fairly proficient at all the things I needed to do, from singing to conducting to playing, and it also was a good testing ground for writing church music. Um, had my first piece published when I was there, and that turned into, eventually, if you count individual pieces in a collection as one, I mean, over 300 things. It just became, part of my income stream.
Yep.
Part of what I do.
Yep.
Sometimes I think writing church music so prolifically maybe kept me from writing some of the things I might have been a little more interested in intellectually. My skills and my reputation were such that I was able to move into a bigger job in the Catholic Church. And you talked about values, alignment, and just being comfortable where you are. I just finally realized that was not the place I wanted to work.
Right.
So I drifted over into the Episcopal Church. Some people, I laugh about our parish I'm at now. It's like it's maybe 40% former Baptists, 40% former Catholics, and what do I got left? 20% cradle Episcopalians. So it's kind of a nice place for people to land. And so I've been working in the Episcopal Church for it. It's closer to 20 years than not. Currently 12 years where I am now. It's a great parish. It's not everything. No gig like that is everything you want. Musically, it's not everything I want, but it's everything. Everything that happens there is something I'm good at. So, and maybe that's just coincidence since I've been there so long. That's where I really started first playing the organ, and I love that. I'm not, I fool a lot of folks. I mean, wow, he's good. So, well, okay, but wait till you hear Cameron Carter. What's that guy, Cameron? Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
hear a real,
Timing,
hear a
timing is
real
everything.
organist.
Timing is everything. I developed the ability, thanks to was William Saunders at JU when you were
Yeah,
there?
I took a couple leds with him.
Yeah, he kind
Rest
of
in peace.
hunted me down, after I was coming out of a practice room, says, "Have you ever played organ?" And I said, "No." It goes, "Well, come by at lunchtime on like Tuesdays." And he gave me free,
Yeah,
lessons for about a semester or two. And anyways, what I
real
learned
sweet.
from there, I did, I developed enough that I could play hymns. And when I first moved to this area where I'm living, I first thing I auditioned for was a church organist. But timing is everything. And the reason they had an opening was because the organist they had had for 75 years retired.
Yeah.
And she, she improved every one of those 75 years. So, they were accustomed to, Bach, Buxtehude, and Cesar Franck,
My
and
folks are not, thank goodness.
yeah. So here I am just playing a loud version of a hymn, with, pretty much the feet doing nothing contrapuntal. And, I knew as I was playing it, I was kind of laughing at the same time, because like, there's just no way they're going to give me this job. And they didn't.
Yeah. Well,
But, um, you, you mentioned it gave you an opportunity to compose. And, this can be a fun thing to figure out, is like, what will the church accept, as far as what will the congregation embrace, what will they not? And you've come up with some things that, I want to kind of hold off for later, involving, genres you may not expect with church. We'll save that for a little
okay.
bit during the conversation. But, um, this is in line with Western, canon tradition. Your composers like Bach, uh, Telemann, for example. It's like I could almost imagine when you said something, that I could imagine Bach saying this. All the work that I've done for the church, maybe has not given me the time to do some of the other things. Yet he found time.
Yeah, he figured it out.
But he comes from an age of I think you could use Bach as someone who had a good career, had a good living, made a good income, but not from an avenue that we would think of today. And I always have to remind myself, he lived in a time when church music was so valued. Well, I should say a time and a place where the church music was so valued that the choral members were paid.
Yeah.
So, and they would, it's amazing. They would learn the music that he wrote, or they'd learn the music Telemann wrote in like that week.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and I couldn't imagine, if I was to give anything that he wrote to any choir that I've worked with, even the best ones, I'd want to allow at least a month.
Yep. Yep.
It's quite
Now
amazing.
there's still choirs out there that can do that, but it's
Right.
rare and becoming even more rare. Um,
And it could be a challenge, if it's something that interests you, if this is an avenue you want to kind of explore creativity, of seeing what do you do well, what does an audience want to hear, and can you meet somewhere? Can you challenge them enough to come towards you, but can you go towards them, to also be accessible? And which is kind of, I guess, not just church. That's a game composers, have often tried to play, except for, what we were talking about before we recorded, you know, a pocket in the 20th century where, you had certain composers who
yeah.
said, who cares what you think? Who cares if you listen?
Well, that's something I've done over my career. Is partly with me, it's been a matter of building trust within a community, because I've really been, two really long-term gigs. And they accept, well, Bob's not going to lead us too far astray, and if he does, it's, well, okay, maybe not every week, but I like to think that I've helped my congregations grow musically
Yeah.
while I've grown musically.
Yeah, this is something, if you when you are quote unquote in charge of the music, which, depending on the church, the pastor or the priest may have
Right, right,
something to say about that. But when you're kind of in,
which is good.
yeah, when you're supposed to be guiding the music, you're always going to get feedback. I mean, this is, in the secular world, you can post your own composition, or you performing something. And if you put it in a public setting where anybody can comment, you might get, you'll hopefully get some compliments, but there's always going to be someone on there say, I don't like that, and they're usually not that nice about it. And in church is no different. There's always going to be somebody, some small vocal minority that's like, we really wish you wouldn't do so much of that and do more of this other thing. And then if you did that, then there'd be some other people saying, we wish you do more of the thing you were doing before. So
Right.
you have to kind of navigate that world of, um, listen, but take things with a grain of salt, and,
It can
make
be hard.
decisions.
Yeah, some people really have they have a tough time. I mean, their congregations are difficult.
Hmm.
I, I'm kind of in a real sweet spot right now for me, and I hope to, I don't feel like I'm going to work that much longer. I mean, I'm starting to think about retiring. So, I'd like to maintain that until, I feel like I've earned it.
Right.
But you have to be ready for the opposition because it's mostly there, and not always very nice about it. So,
Right.
a good church musician is also a good uh, politician. You have good people skills. There's a lot to cultivate there, that you don't always think about when you're, in the practice room practicing Bach and Buxtehude.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to the game.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about like how some of these gigs might be constructed in terms of like what you're expected to do. Now I forgot to lay out this term for the listeners, but for the sake of keeping this a comfortable length as far as a single episode, there are two big umbrellas, I think, of church music jobs you can have, in at least in the United States, and that would be traditional and contemporary, just what falls under that umbrella.
Yeah.
And for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about contemporary today because your background is mostly traditional. Although we'll get in some things that kind of push the boundary of whether or not it's traditional or something a little bit more contemporary. But primarily, I want to kind of talk about that style of music. And I made a list of just like what if you're a music director and if you're not just like an accompanist, these are how your job might be constructed. You could be like just the choir leader only, or you could say like choir slash song leader, like someone who leads the hymns but doesn't actually play anything. But you're a vocalist and you're working with vocalists, or you might be working with instrumentalists, but you're not hired to play an instrument. So that's one thing you could have. And then you could be someone who plays the choir and a keyboard instrument, like you're a choir plus the organist. Sorry, you're a choir director plus the organist, or music director plus an organist, or a music director plus a pianist. And then they could have multiple keyboards, and you have to cover all of them in kind of a rotation. It's like you're leading the choir, you're basically doing everything related to the music other than singing in the choir. You're leading those instruments. And of course, there's some other things that you could have. You could have an instrumental ensemble if the church's, budget will support that, or if you have enough people that are willing to participate. You could have soloists. You could have I was fortunate enough to have a handbell group for quite a while that was very good. Even though it was just a 3-octave group, it's like they were all very good, and I would say some of them were pretty advanced, so as a composer that gave me some opportunities to do some things as well, but
Right.
also
That'd be fun.
just uh so what are some of the hats that you've had? I know you've taken up organ, but I also know that you play piano. So like how would you describe like what is it that you do? uh we'll ignore like preparation like Wednesdays. What is it that you do in services as a musician, as a conductor or a performer?
Um, it, Mostly you've covered it pretty well. I mean, I've been in back in my big Catholic job. I always had what we used to call an accompanist, but now we call a collaborative musician. So I was strictly the choral director. Although if you have more than one service, sometimes you have to do other things.
Yeah.
But I would have an accompanist for the choir, so there would be a two-headed beast working with the choir. In my current position, I'm the primary organist and pianist, depending on I choose which instrument to use according to what serves the music the best. More a slightly more traditional Episcopal service, I'll use just organ normally, and people will sing hymns and service music, and the organ is, in my opinion, the very best instrument to support a big group of people singing. Some will argue, but I am on occasion able to bring in several times a month an accompanist with my choir so that I'm free to be a choral conductor. Within a service, that's what I do.
Right.
Uh, but the particular job that I'm in now,
So,
I'd love to go ahead.
oh no, no, that's fine. Let's segue into that. So, want to talk about like the tools and the skills that you need if you're going to do this job well. So, if you're multitasking, if you are leading a choir, but at the same time you're the accompanist, for that piece. What are some things you've had to learn to do to be able to communicate with the choir as you're playing?
Well, that's we call that directing from the console.
Hmm.
Even if you're from the piano keyboard, uh, you really have to. This is what works for me. My choir has to be very. It took a while to get them to this point. They have to be very prepared. And they really need to know. They need to know the music so that they're not relying on you to give them every single cue and cutoff, because obviously your hands and your feet are occupied. You learn you learn to communicate a lot with your head, facial expressions, nods, other things. This strictly me speaking. Some organists are just masters at directing from the console. I would not consider myself a master at it. I'm competent and have been successful, but by no means would I give a master class. You have to learn how to possibly occasionally edit what you have in front of you as far as the keyboard part. What could you leave out to do that? Maybe something is voiced differently. Of course, having the pedal board available, that gives you less to do with your hands. But
Right.
if you're at the piano, ultimately though, I feel like something is compromised.
Right.
You're never going to get every note on the piano and every cue for your choir. That's why I feel the best situation is when you're working with a choral group with a choral piece is to have somebody on the keys and somebody
Right.
conducting. It's just
Yeah.
that's your best, but that's often not possible,
Right.
just financially or personnel wise.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny. I had a former church that, financially was not doing well, but they still had a model of three people in music. They had an organist, a pianist,
Yeah,
and a music director. And it's like, I left, you know, long before it came to that point, but I was just like, at some point, one of these accompanists is going to get let go. And um, one of them left after I left. So that's another story. But at the same time, that's very rare, and that's a pretty small church, even under your bigger churches. It's hard to find anything better than you have an accompanist and a music director. And the music director is pretty much expected to play part of the time, if at least, if not, you're the sole
and
thing.
it depends on the denomination too. If you're working a Catholic gig,
Hmm.
big Catholic church could have 5 to 7 masses a weekend.
Right.
So you're going to be working with an individual soloist or a cantor, as they would call it, more often than you're going to work with a choir.
Right.
Episcopal churches don't have quite the multiplicity of services, but I will say that the organist slash choir master model, doing everything, is fairly common in the Episcopal church.
Right.
You'll see a big church that'll have their, choir stalls and have the guy in the or guy or girl in the middle, and then the organist somewhere else. I mean, that's it's a big job. So they have the money pay for it.
So to summarize so far, we've talked about how the essential things you have to have is the ability to conduct a group. You have
Right?
to have the ability to play a keyboard instrument, though, probably specific to whatever job you're trying to get, whether that be organ or piano. And it's not required, but it's a benefit to you and your group, your church, if you are able to arrange or compose for your group. I mean, besides just being a creative outlet, it's also it saves your church money because you're able to supplement, I mean, from one composer to another, certainly encourage your church to spend money and support other composers out there, but it is very good if you can uh, create the music yourself, and just it's just another avenue. But one skill we haven't really talked about yet, but it's obviously there. If you're leading choir, you're leading voices, you have to have either some voice training or at least how to teach what you need out of the vocalist. So, did you have voice lessons, or how did you come about what you needed to know to be able to communicate with choirs?
Um, I was a band guy, so I was more focused on instrumental training through the years. But I did sing in a choir 1 year in high school, a school chorus. Wasn't until I got to, well, no, I think when I first went to college, I sang in the university chorus because I needed an ensemble
Mhm.
um, as a comp major, and I didn't want to be in the marching band. This was at the University of South Carolina, so that was a big deal. Didn't want to do that. So I sang in the concert choir. Well, the catch-all, whatever it was called, University Singers. So I sang a little bit there. I thought, oh, I can sing. And then when I finally got to JU, I took some voice lessons, and because I was working in a church at that time, and realized, I've got a pretty good voice.
Hmm.
So Eloise Truitt, you remember?
Yes.
Yeah, you remember her? I don't know if she was around.
Yes.
And Bill Vessels, I took some voice lessons with those two.
Right.
I think they're both deceased now. So, but that was individual, um, soloistic
Yeah.
pedagogy. So what I really have had to do over the years is a lot of independent study. I never pursued any academic choral conducting because it was always theory and comp.
Mhm.
That's what I do, and all the other stuff helps me do that.
Right.
Uh, Keeps the lights on.
Right.
Uh, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Uh, so there are tons of resources even within a church denomination or the American Choral Directors Association. You can learn good vocal pedagogy, um, and it'll overlap with solo work, working with a choir. But some of it's a little different because you have different kinds of different voice types all in one place, different experience levels. But my underlying philosophy is just don't do any harm. You know,
Right.
you really you don't want to push people further than they need to go, and you don't want to say things that you're not entirely sure of.
Hmm.
Um, eh, I don't know if I'm even answering your question anymore, but
Well, no. No, I think kind of maybe going off that though, but that's very similar to me. Although you have more training than I do. I did uh, all all the vocal pedagogy I learned was being an accompanist in lessons and just
yeah,
listen, and I accompanied for everybody. I did, by the way, I preferred accompanying for Mrs. Truitt's classes because she tended to get a lot of the non-music majors that were working on simpler pieces, so they were
yeah,
easy to
and the
decipher.
non-vocal majors like me.
Yes. Yes. It's like whenever I accompanied anybody for Dr. Vessels, it's just like, okay, this is going to be hard.
A lot of notes.
Yep. And Peggy Azell. It's like
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's like she would have some more challenging students, but also some easier students. She was kind of right in the middle, but as far as that goes. Uh, Maybe if I was to just kind of, if we were to make a list of like what do you definitely need to know, and and not that we're going to like teach it on this podcast, but things you should go look up, videos, books, maybe find a mentor to learn, and maybe things that you can avoid. So I'll kind of start the things I think you don't need to necessarily know. You don't have to get into the whole idea of understanding all of the mechanics that go into belting and head voice and chest voice and mix and blend, and these are all things that vocal teachers really will spend a lot of time on, but I don't think you even have time for that in the amount of time that you get to rehearse. It's not like we're rehearsing every day. Most people, if you're like me, you're rehearsing once a week, and you might have an hour and maybe an hour and a half depending on the situation, so you don't get a
Mhm.
lot of time with the choir. So I would say those fine details are something that really you don't need to work on, but I think you should probably work on understand how to breathe properly. That's good even if you're that's good to learn even if you're not singing. Everyone should learn how to breathe properly in a way that supports good tone. And then um and the big thing is understanding how to shape vowels and consonants so that everybody does it the same way and so that it sounds like a unified whole. And I think to me, those are the two big ones, but I don't know if there's anything else that you would add to that.
No, I think you kind of zeroed in what I think is important. What I've learned over the years is that you need to try to, especially with volunteer choirs. I have had the luxury of having a few paid singers mixed in, but they're just there to help make everybody sound better. But the thing is to try to avoid, for me, to try to avoid lingo. Kind of get people where you want to go, as far as posture and breathing and vowel formation and consonant placement. Try to get them there without speaking like they're vocal majors.
Yeah.
And not talk down to them, but give them visualizations and ways to get to the point you want to get to without making it seem like it's a voice lesson, although it's usually the voice lesson, the only voice lesson they'll ever have will be in choir.
Right.
And I think it's important to model what you're asking for as a conductor. And that gets harder when you're also running the rehearsal from the keyboard. But yeah, but you're right. Posture and breathing and vowel formation, consonants. That's choral singing right there.
Yeah.
But there are so many great resources for that. Even just go to YouTube, Pete's sake. But you got to be careful because you can also get bad advice.
Yeah, that's true. What does a rehearsal look like for you? Have you planned what you're working on in advance? Have you given like a time allotment to things? Like how much detail do you like if you were to plan a rehearsal, say this week, what would it kind of look like?
Well, we can speak to what I think is ideal or to what sometimes actually happens.
Sure.
But ideal for me is that I have, well, let's say I'm getting ready to start my fall rehearsals back in first week of September. I'll have already, I prepare their folders ahead of time.
Mhm.
Everything's basically in the order of the service and also in the order that I'm going to rehearse it. Because I've learned over the years that the worst thing in the world is just, at least for me, is to just stuff a bunch of things in a folio and say, now we're going to do this. And then you spend 10 minutes trying to find. So I've tried to be very organized.
Mhm.
And that means that I've got maybe the next month. Sometimes the particular in an Episcopal church, you work through liturgical seasons.
Mhm.
I'll work through up until December. We'll have sort of a stretch, and then we get Advent and Christmas, and that's a whole different thing. So I'll work in seasonally. Like, well, what do we got coming up this week? And then I'll touch on the thing that we have for next week, and then maybe a week ahead, just so that we're not learning a new thing every week, something we've touched. At least I want to get at least a little work on something a month ahead of time. Because the choir needs, they need that. Like you were saying earlier, we're not going to throw a cantata a week at them.
Right.
Um, that's just not the way the world works now. But the most important thing is that I'm organized and I know what I'm going to do within that rehearsal and what I'm going to do in the next couple of weeks. And then you have to be prepared for people not being there or things not going as well as you think they were going to. Need a plan B. We did that last Easter. I had I thought, a really great anthem for Easter Sunday for my choir. And it became very apparent about 3 weeks into it. It's like, mm. And everybody knew it too. So you gotta have a plan B.
Do you give yourself a schedule when you're rehearsing? So, for example, I'm just going to make up a time here. Let's say the rehearsal starts at 7 o'clock. Do you say, okay, we're going to warm up for 5 minutes, 7:05? we're going to rehearse what we're doing for this upcoming Sunday, and then maybe 7:20 or 7:25 we're going to look at what's after that. Have do you have kind of like everything kind of timed out? And of course, as you say, there's ideal and reality, but do you have an ideal scenario like that planned, or do you just kind of go in the moment?
Yeah, I don't think I always start with a rough plan of what I want to accomplish that night. I might have a couple things like, well, we've got to do this.
Mhm.
Um, and I make sure that we get this done. So that affects everything on down the road. I think I've become less rigid
Yeah,
as to what this is what we're doing.
right.
Um, and it's also because I'm pretty good at reading a room now.
Hmm.
Um, and I wasn't always, and I was very, the arrogance of youth, and also that faking it till you make it. When you're
Right.
just starting out, you tend to over want people to think you're smarter than you are. But
Right.
and not that I have learned everything I need to know, but I can read a room and I can see when people are getting tired of something and it's just not working. Then you have to be flexible. I think that's the best way to say it. And that's the way I approach it.
Yeah, I just wanted to contrast that. So, I too have relaxed, but I still would be what you call anal when it comes to that. So, when I started, I had it, I had everything figured out down to the minutes. Like I had an hour to do this, and I would have things like I mean, literally would say 7:33 we do this, and then 7:41 we do this, and I would even have it marked down as we're going to focus on measures 16 through 32 of this piece. And um
Well, you know what we say about that down where we are. Bless your heart.
yes. Um Eventually I started rounding off. It's like, okay, 7:45, 8 o'clock, and then I would have the piece on there and I might put off to the side, focus on the section. It's like I would do that. But then at the same time, you learn to read the room and so forth. But yeah, that first picture I gave you, that was me in my 20s. It was as I was leading rehearsal. And
Yeah, that's a different. I mean, you get to be a different person,
yeah,
hopefully, over
yeah.
the years. Stick with it.
And I am going to follow this up with an episode, a long overdue. I want to give a snapshot into because a lot of the skills I've learned in church, I learned for theater music directing, and I want to just
Oh yeah.
talk about how I design a rehearsal. And you have to be more on the anal side when it comes to theater music directing, just because you're talking about 2 hours of music in a lot of cases, and you
Yeah.
get Uh, gosh, maybe 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks to rehearse the music portion. Then they're off, they're doing choreography and they're learning other things, so that's a little bit more intense. But on the other hand, the rehearsals are 3 hours long.
And a lot of times you've got a bigger, higher skill level.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, sometimes.
hopefully. Yeah, that's not my world. I've dipped my toe in it a few times with people, and
Right,
I love it, but that's just not.
right.
I'm not good enough for that.
So I'm going to come back to this topic. That's going to be probably the next episode after this one.
Yeah, I'll look
Um,
for that.
I was looking at my notes, and this precedes, or I should say, I wrote these notes down before I did my most recent series. So, um, I I just finished a series on what I call the four core performance skills, which is like if you know these four skills, you're prepared for anything, any situation. So, sight reading, and
Mhm.
that's under the umbrella of read playing while reading music, but sight reading, that getting it well the first time, it saves you practice time. It's also beneficial in certain situations, like if you're accompanying, so forth. But
Mhm.
playing by ear, improvising, and transposing. And and my personally, I've used all four in as a church music director slash accompanist. I have made up arrangements on the spot, improvised arrangements. I've obviously sight read. I've played some things by ear, and I've also transposed. And one of the things that I know is a little bit more common in more organ-driven services is this tradition of the final verse of a hymn. I know that I went to Southside Methodist when Bill Saunders was the
Yeah.
organist there, and you had no idea what he was going to play on that last verse. It's like the first two verses is pretty much what was in the hymnal, and then that last verse could be, uh, I don't know, the most complicated thing you ever heard, where just very shifting chords. It's like, don't try to harmonize it, just sing the melody because it's going all over the place. But and sometimes he would transpose that last one and like, hey, let's go up a step or something like that. Have you as a performer played around with anything like that in your hymns?
That, in my understanding of the church music world, that is the realm of a really skilled organist.
Mm,
And they cultivate that, they develop that. Um, I'll pull out more stops. I might mess, like if you're talking about a final stanza.
right.
Um, I don't tread in that territory too much because I don't really feel like I'm that skilled as an organist. And it's not something that I've wanted to spend, what is our most valuable thing is time.
Right.
That's not something I've really chosen to develop. Um, but in the right hands, there's an organist that he's passed away now, that Anglican musicians revere, a guy named Jerry Hancock,
Mm,
Gerre. Um, look him up if
mm.
you're interested in what a really skilled improvisatory service music playing organist can do. Um, but you have to have a lot of tools in your toolbox and wear a lot of hats, but you don't have to be the best at all of them. And that's one that's not my thing. Now, the other three you mentioned, those I'm down with that.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Okay.
no, it's the transposing. I don't do a lot of that on the fly.
Right.
Um, the other three, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Let's kind of talk about one more thing, and that is, we want to come back to the idea that when you are the music director and you're given a sense of freedom, you can sometimes come up with ideas that are outside the box. And I know that you have come up with a thing called Jazz Vespers. So
Well,
talk to me about just talk about Jazz Vespers, how that came about, and what that's like.
well, that's not something I came up with. I'll tell you
Okay.
that.
Okay.
That has a long tradition back. I would say most people pinpoint New York City, where you had a lot of musicians working late into the night, and they weren't going to be getting up to go to services on a Sunday morning, so they would offer Vespers, being from the old monastic tradition, the evening prayer of the church. Vespers. In the classical world, the Rachmaninoff Vespers. It's a big evening service. So they'd have their church later in the day, and being jazz musicians, New York City, they'd bring their art to it. Um, I first kind of dipped my toe in this with our friend Tony Steve at our local Episcopal cathedral years ago. They did a jazz vespers 2 or 3 times a year, and he asked me to come in and play piano, and I never played any jazz at that point. I was familiar with a lead sheet, but it's the difference between, like, back in those days, the Catholic lead sheet would be, well, we got a G, we got a D, we got an E minor, geared to our guitarist. Well, he's putting these things in front of me, you know, E7, sharp 4, flat 9. I'm like, what? So anyway, I kind of fell in love with it, and I've gotten better. But we have an evening service at my parish, and once a month we started it. This is well into its second year. Um, a jazz vesper. So one Sunday a month, it's right out of our Episcopal prayer book. It's an evening service, but all the music, the hymns, the psalms, everything else are done in jazz style. And then we do a set of, I push the limit a bit with the repertoire we do, but I always try to figure out, well, what is something that's churchy about this? Last Advent we did uh we did a whole Miles Davis service, basically thinking about Kind of Blue. And in the liturgical colors, the season of Advent is blue, purple, so I always kind of find some kind of hook.
Right.
But to me, it speaks to my flock. We've talked about a lot about traditional worship. I kind of view my way of doing things as being more of a eclectic approach, even
Yeah.
within our high church.
Hmm.
I'll use the piano. I'll use what serves the music. The repertoire isn't all out of our hymn book or you know um, classical Anglican church music. Tallis, all the greats. I don't just stick to that. I do what serves, what I think serves the parish. So jazz is just one other stylistic element that I think personally I love it. And I play trumpet too, so it's just it's part of who I am. But oddly enough, it really works in Christian worship because when you think about it, jazz comes out of the blues and blues comes out of spirituals, and it's all rooted in a very, the whole spirituality of a culture. So it's not so far out the box, I think, and it's very popular. We draw 100 or more every Sunday evening out in way out in Mandarin, if you
Hmm.
remember where that is.
Yeah.
Even during football season. So it's like,
Oh. Yeah. Well, I
so
mean,
it,
to be fair, like the Jaguars aren't the most rabid of the NFL fan base.
well, there's there's the NFL ticket. I mean, people are watching it.
Well, that's true.
Um, and not everybody watches football.
Little trivia, by the way, since you mentioned Kind of Blue, Miles Davis, I'm 20 miles away from a university where his trumpet is behind a glass case that he used for that album. It's pretty
Oh
neat.
wow.
Yeah, it's a UNCG. So,
The coolest instrument behind glass I ever saw was in Charleston, where I'm from, Charlotte, South Carolina. At the museum, they have Gershwin's piano that he wrote Porgy and Bess on.
oh wow, that's
But Miles' trumpet now
yeah.
there.
And of course, I live in the town, where John Coltrane grew up. So it's like
Yeah,
part of the thing I'm doing this year is I'm going through all of his recordings. I'm like maybe halfway through. There's a lot of them.
we did uh we did the whole Love Supreme at one of our Vespers during
Yeah.
the meditation part. It's got really good tenor player.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you what, wasn't easy, but
No.
it was a spiritual experience. I'm telling you,
Nice.
people dug it.
So much we could talk about, but I feel like we covered, some of the main principles. So, share with us where people can find out more about you as the composer, like where can they listen to your music, buy your music, or just find out more about you.
My website's okay. It's bobmooremusic.com. Needs a little work. I don't sell a lot through there, but I have links to some of the other projects I've done, and it's always on my list to improve. So
Does it have a list of like, where people can buy your music for like, because you've done a lot of choral music, so for their
yeah,
church.
there's links to all the places where I've published with, well, not just brick and mortar publishers, but a couple of self. Not, well, yeah. Anyway, that's
Sure.
all. That's all.
All right. Well, thanks for taking time to chat with me today about, this world of church music directing.
It's a living.
And that's going to wrap up episode number 90 of the Musician Toolkit. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you would share it and by whatever means you want to on your social media, in a text, in an email, someone who might get something out of this episode. If you're following along on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. All right, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back with you again next week.